Good morning and welcome to today's event, Phase 2 of Vaccine Diplomacy, Expanding Global Vaccine Production Capabilities. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I'm the Acting Director of the Latin American Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank my colleagues in the Wilson Center's Argentina project, Mexico Institute, Brazil Institute, Global Europe Program, and the Science and Technology Innovation Program for all of their support for today's dialogue. Latin America has a long history of successful vaccination campaigns. In parts of the region, there's tremendous vaccine development and production capacity. In general, however, this is a region, like many developing regions, that is heavily dependent on medical imports of all types. That challenge has been painfully evident throughout this pandemic. Latin America was one of the regions hardest hit by the COVID-19 virus, and its response was hampered by the cost and complication of securing urgently needed medical supplies, such as personal protective equipment and tests. In all, Latin America's underdeveloped health manufacturing industry has produced just 4% of the medical products governments in this region imported for COVID-19 response. In 2019, the cost of the region's healthcare imports was twice the amount the region earned through its healthcare exports, a deficit that reached $20 billion. This import dependency, which gave rise to so-called medical diplomacy early in the pandemic, also includes vaccines. Until recently, that meant delays to immunization campaigns throughout the region. Eventually, most of Latin America did acquire the vaccines it needed, in part through so-called vaccine diplomacy. That is, the vaccine donations by the United States, vaccine sales by China and Russia, and help from the global COVAX initiative. But the health consequences have nevertheless been immense. In all, Latin America has suffered nearly 30% of global COVID-19 deaths, though the region makes up just 8% of the world's population. Life expectancy in Latin America and the Caribbean has decreased from 75.1 years in 2019 to 72.2 years in 2021. In part, this reflects chronic underinvestment in the region's health systems, including in research and development. The Pan American Health Organization, which we all know as PAHO, recommends that governments spend at least 6% of GDP on public health. Many countries do not come close to meeting that target. There are also related technological barriers. That is particularly true with regards to vaccine development and manufacturing, both to address continued challenges from COVID-19 and to prepare for potential future pandemics. In response, Latin American leaders, like their counterparts in other developing regions, have sought international support not only to procure safe and effective vaccines, but to boost their capacity to develop and produce vaccines locally. Beijing has recognized that demand. In Chile, for example, the Chinese company Sinovac is building a factory to produce tens of millions of doses of its COVID-19 jab. For a time, neighboring Argentina was producing Russia's Sputnik vaccine, and in partnership with Mexico, manufacturing the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. Cuba has developed and produced 3 of its own vaccines, and at least 2 Brazilian institutions hope to make available locally developed doses. For now, however, no country in the region has come up with a vaccine based on US-developed mRNA technology, which offers the best protection against this virus and is seen as essential to prepare for future COVID-19 variants and new viruses. With support from PAHO, Argentine and Brazilian biopharmaceutical companies eventually hope to master mRNA technology, but at this point, the region continues to depend on imported vaccines, leaving it vulnerable. In today's discussion, we're going to explore the region's history with vaccination drives, its prospects for improving self-sufficiency across medical industries, and how international partnerships, both with governments, multilateral institutions, and the private sector, could help make that happen. And I'm delighted to announce the experts that we have brought with us today to have this important dialogue. They include Daniel Rodriguez, the acting chief of the PAHO Revolving Fund for Access to Vaccines and Director for Procurement and Supply Management at PAHO. Jan Spahn, who served as Germany's health minister during some of the most challenging moments of the pandemic. John Lepore, Moderna's Senior Vice President of Government Engagement, and Shosani Kuer, Vice Director of Quality at Biomanginus. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for watching this conversation for those of you participating remotely. Daniela, I want to start with you for a historical perspective, and then you can quickly take us to COVID-19, of what Latin America has achieved historically when it comes to the development and production locally of vaccines and successful vaccination drives. Because going into COVID-19, the region had earned a reputation for success in this important area of public health.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you to the Wilson Center for inviting Pajo. So Latin America has a long-standing history of success in the immunization space. It's one of the most successful, it's the most successful region in terms of elimination of polio, measles. There was a rapid introduction of vaccines in the last 10 years of pneumococcal conjugated, rotavirus, HPV vaccine. As a fact, more than 90% of the populations that target populations of the vaccines resides in countries that already have the vaccines in their immunization schedules. So the reason of this success is the strong political commitment at the regional level, at the country level, the strong technical expertise of our immunization programs and Pajo's technical cooperation. And one of the key pillars has been the Pajo Revolving Fund for Access to Vaccines, which is the largest pool procurement mechanism for self-financing countries in the world, and that for over 4 decades have supported countries on accessing vaccines of quality and low prices. And the Revolving Fund became part of the COVAX facility. So Pajo, along with UNICEF, defined the procurement strategy, and the Pajo Revolving Fund took care of the delivery of the COVAX doses to Latin American countries. But the shortages that occurred during the pandemic highlight the Latin America's dependency on vaccines, not only vaccines, but diagnostics and oral health technologies imported from outside the region. So we saw insufficient supply to meet the global demand, disruptions in global supply chains, geographic concentrations in production. We saw advanced purchases by developed countries, bilaterals that contributed to the inequity in the distribution of health technologies, leaving many of the countries of the Americas a region in the waiting queue. So just some key figures in this regard. So only 13% of the Latin American and the Caribbean pharmaceutical imports are originated in this same region. And there's a global concentration of pharma production. So 9 of the top 10 exporters of pharmaceuticals are developed countries. Plus 8 from Europe, 1 from the US, and 1 from India. So there's a lot of concentration. And in terms of vaccines, so the global vaccine market is highly concentrated in few companies. So 4 companies makes 90% of the market value, and 6 manufacturers produce 60% of the world total volume. And 19 vaccines have less than 3 global suppliers, of which 8 are monopolies and 8 are duopolies. So we see a huge concentration, but a lot of opportunities in our region to scale up those production capacities and leverage the use of the Revolving Fund as a platform to foster that supply to across the region.
Thank you, Daniel. Shostani, when we hear about these, the concentration of production of vaccines globally, it makes it sound like regions like Latin America are doomed to be on the outside of the production and development side of these critical technologies forevermore. But as you know better than most, Brazil, in fact, is on the cutting edge of a lot of this research and has had success and has great potential in this area. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what your company is working on, but also Brazil's biopharmaceutical industry in general, and what its capabilities are, and what would be required to have it play a bigger role in addressing the scarcity and concentration that Daniel has just described.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you the invitation from Wilson Center to participate in this meeting. Well, here in Biomanguinhos, we are a public foundation. We linked to Fiocruz, that's a public foundation. So we are linked to the Minister of Health. And we are the biggest supplier of the National Immunization Program here in Brazil. We have 11 vaccines in our portfolio, and we are supplying since 1976 we have some quick response to public health emergencies, and it was not different in this COVID pandemic. So Biomanguinhos rapidly, we have a big movement to supply Ministry of Health, not even vaccine, but also diagnostics. So we developed a PCR kit for diagnosis of COVID-19. It's our development. And after that, we introduced here in Brazil in less than one year and a half, the production, the total production, the nationalized production of COVID-19 vaccine. That was a tech transfer from the AstraZeneca vaccine. And now we supply to our country more than 200 million doses of vaccine. And beside this, we have, as Danielle said, we are in the conjunction with PAHO and WHO. We are a hub for Latin America and Caribbean mRNA vaccine production. So we are developing, it's our own development. Our vaccine, it's a plug and play, self-amplify RNA technology. It's totally proprietary from Biomanguinhos. And we are planning to have the first clinical trial next year. So we are trying to build capacity of this, not only the vaccines that are in the market for a long time, but also for this new technology. We are also building a new area, a new facility that will increase our capacity in 4 to 6 times. So we can not only supply the Brazilian market, but also Latin America and perhaps some other countries. We have a pre-qualified vaccine, yellow fever, that's pre-qualified. So we supply this vaccine for more than 70 countries around the world. And our intention is to amplify this capacity to provide Latin America. But of course, it's important to point out that as a public institution, we are depending on a national and public funding. So this, in certain ways, keep us not in the velocity that we want to go, because we're depending on the budget of the government. So we can do more if we have more funding. That's the main point.
I'm glad you brought up this question of velocity. It's not a small issue when it comes to life-saving medical products, including vaccines, and when it comes to preparation for potential new variants or future pandemics. And so, that brings me to you, John, and the questions that have arisen when thinking about whether the private sector has a role to play in sharing some of its knowledge, in spreading more geographically its manufacturing. I just want to hear from you, what is so important about mRNA technology? Why do we focus on it so much? Why is it different in terms of the challenge of sharing this knowledge, of manufacturing your products abroad? And what are the prospects for regions like Latin America to master this technology going forward?
Thanks for the question, and thanks to the Wilson Center for including Moderna in this conversation. I'm particularly glad to be on a panel with all the panelists, but also with Daniel and Jens, who were key partners for Moderna from the very early days in the pandemic. And through their partnership and their leadership enabled us to ship over 800 million doses of our COVID-19 vaccine last year, 25% of which went to low and middle income countries through COVAX, through government donations, and through direct supply agreements, including with the government of Colombia, which was one of the very early countries that contracted for our vaccine. And I think that goes to your question around why is mRNA important. If you think back to the very beginning of the pandemic, and when governments were looking to the vaccine industry for solutions, a lot of the focus was on the traditional technology, and with the expectation that those proven, trusted technologies would be the solution to this current pandemic. And it was difficult for some governments to be able to take a risk early on in the pandemic to sign supply agreements with mRNA companies, which prior to the pandemic had not been a proven technology. And what we learned, though, as the pandemic progressed, is that, one, it was highly successful, the most successful of the vaccines for COVID available, but also the speed at which the vaccines could be developed. Within 2 days of Moderna receiving the sequence from Chinese authorities for COVID-19, we were able to design our own sequence that would become our vaccine. 42 days later, we had clinical batch material. That is unprecedented. That allowed us to move at the speed that we did. At a time when we're small today, we're 3,500 employees. We were about 800 employees when all of that was happening. And we had only very limited production capacity to make clinical trial material. So the speed was key as we developed our first vaccine. And then as we were discussing with regulators around the world about how do we address variants, we saw that speed was also a key in what the FDA had asked us to do over the summer, which was to focus on BA.4 and 5 bivalent vaccine. Previously, we were in discussions about focusing on BA.1. And it was again, the speed that allowed conversations that were happening over the summer to accelerate vaccine development and production such that we now have updated boosters available globally in again, record time.
I appreciate that. Maybe if I could just ask you to think a little bit about the experience you've just described that Moderna has had and what would be lessons for other governments, private research institutions, health ministries, in terms of thinking about mRNA technology and its broad applicability, the speed that you describe, how it might again be shared in a way that could spread the benefits that were realized throughout COVID-19.
Yeah, and this is a question we get asked often, not surprisingly, and it's being asked around the world. There are a lot of reflections ongoing about lessons learned. One, I would say, probably the most important for the work that we did in the U.S. was our collaboration with the U.S. government, particularly with BARDA. That allowed us to leverage prior work that had been done, and then to accelerate the development of our vaccine. So governments having the capability to be involved early on in innovative technologies was key to our success, and I think would be in the future, and the same would be true in other countries. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the ability in a crisis to have the financial ability and the legislative ability to place bets on a wide range of technologies, not knowing which one would ultimately be successful. And as I said, for those governments that were able to take that risk and contract with us very early, that allowed us to finance and progress the development of the vaccine, but also ensure that there was early access. And the last part that I would add is creating a sustaining ecosystem that is ready to support the development of innovative vaccines when the pandemic hits. And that ecosystem creation is not unique to any part of the world. If you look at, as you were mentioning earlier, sort of where vaccine, and Daniel was mentioning where vaccine production currently is located, there are reasons for that. It's because those countries have created the sustaining ecosystem that allows innovation and development to thrive. And they also are prioritizing not just the development of the vaccines, but more importantly, the use of the vaccines. And I think going into the future, one of the most important lessons learned from this pandemic is the importance of adult vaccination. If the countries, I think, that have the ability to have a high degree of awareness about the value of adult vaccination will be those that will experience the early benefits when those pandemic vaccines are available in the future.
Jens, John talks about the factors that led to Moderna's ability to be developing these technologies for many years before the pandemic and to ramp up quickly. They're not resources that are widely available in the developing world, the kinds of investments the United States government made in this case, the kinds of commitments to purchase vaccines when it was unproven. This brings me to the question of vaccine diplomacy, the idea that if these kinds of efforts are going to occur in other parts of the world, they're going to need the support of European governments, of the United States, of multilateral institutions. I'm interested both in your thoughts and how that is occurring, if it is occurring at the right pace. And then also maybe later we'll get into the why. What would be the motivation for governments like yours to think about improving capabilities in places like Latin America? But maybe if I could ask, let's start with the first question, which is, what's your take on the status of efforts to replicate Moderna's success in places that don't have the benefits that I think John described Moderna receiving from the United States?
Well, Benjamin, first of all, thank you for having us all and organizing this. And if I might start with a more general remark regarding the vaccine campaign globally. I mean, I know I have been to WHO discussions in Geneva and wherever on the world, and many say it was too slow and we should have been quicker and so on. And I understand it, and I see that we should be even faster next time. But one thing is true too. This was the fastest vaccine campaign in the history of humankind. And we should every now and then realize it. Never before, when there was a new virus on the world, somewhere emerging, within just 2 years, we had enough vaccines to more or less vaccinate and give immunization to the whole world. I mean, this was as quick as never before. So I accept all the critics that say there was a bias in it and not every region has it from the very beginning. It's all very fair points, and we should discuss to do it in a better way next time. But first of all, a step back, I would say this was a great success story so far, and it remains to be one. First thing. Second is, I had the honor to accompany President Macron, the French president, to South Africa for a state visit as a German, when I still was in the government, as a German minister. This is a very rare thing. You see that there is a different nation in the delegation. And it was about building up production capacities in Africa, who, for good reasons, say the same. That 99% of the vaccines used in Africa for all infectious diseases are not produced on the continent of Africa. And we had that discussion that was there and still is there about the patent waiver and how would you actually get other regions to have a production site as well and production capacities. And our point from the very beginning was, let's try to do it through cooperation, but not by forcing the companies. Because what I see and what I know from all the companies, and we just heard it from John, is that they actually were willing and still are to cooperate. And I would say there are not many things more complex to produce than a vaccine. This is really, really, really a very complex production. So the tech transfer is very important. And so I would say it's important to see that it is better done through a cooperation with tech transfer and without forcing anyone than it is just with a patent. It's not enough to produce it. You really need the people that can do it. And so I would say the way through cooperation is the best way. And then, of course, the question is, what is an environment? What are the tools that you actually can invite both sides, or where can perhaps other countries support this, to invite to cooperate? What is the right ecosystem actually for this kind of cooperation? And for that, of course, you need a legal framework, a national legal framework, or a country legal framework, for example, when it comes to patents, when it comes to studies. By the way, many studies worldwide were done in Latin America too. With research, because of the good universities there that were a very big part of the international network for the studies. So it is, of course, about money, which universities, as I just said, researchers, you need skilled people and stuff like that.
And then I would say cooperation is the right way to do so. Of course, I mean, that's a question actually to the countries then. Do you want to have a national health or pharmaceutical industry, or is it more cooperating with international companies and being part of an international network? And I think the second way is the better way, the quicker way to get there. A third thing, if I might add, because we have the Pan-American Health Organization with us, and it's a regional discussion too. You know, within the European Union, we had a big discussion if we should move on together, all 27 within the European Union, or if Germany or France or Italy or whoever is walking alone, 27 on their own. And one thing is for sure, France and Germany or perhaps Brasilia or Argentina might be big enough and with the economic size to actually be one of the first ones to get the vaccines and to have contracts. But the smaller countries on a continent, in a region, for them, of course, it's much more difficult. And so we made a very fundamental discussion which actually was challenged here in the national debate, if that was the right step to do, because it took a bit longer, and that we want to have the whole region, all 27, might be big size or smaller size, at the same day to start the vaccine campaign. So for us in this pandemic situation regarding the vaccine campaign, it was a moment of regional cooperation too, that really made a difference, for the people. And so I would say it's about cooperation with the companies, better than forcing them and you just have a patent and no tech transfer. And it's a good way, at least that's our experience, to do it in a regional cooperation too, that has an added value for everyone. One last thought for the beginning, because you mentioned China and Russia and the Chinese vaccine. Of course, there is vaccine diplomacy. And it was, by the way, the European Union, not the US, not the UK, but the European Union that from the first day on exported vaccines. I had that discussion within the G7 health ministers meeting several times with my friends and partners from the US and the UK, that actually we started very soon for one reason. We did not want China and Russia to do their diplomacy, and the Western world, the democratic world is not on the world stage and not cooperating with other countries. I imagine a world, especially with this war 2 hours from Berlin here in the Ukraine, imagine a world in which only Russia and China had developed a vaccine. It would not, from my perspective, be a good world. And so actually in cooperation with other countries, other regions, to build up vaccine research and production capacities is, yes, a kind of diplomacy too, but especially it's a cooperation of democracies and regions where we as the US or the European Union, I think we have to play a role if we want partners around the world to stand together in difficult times like a pandemic.
Immensely helpful, Jens, and I want to come back to you in a bit to talk more about the geostrategic considerations here. The idea that not only was there a period where regions like Latin America did turn to Russia and China for their vaccine deliveries and purchases, but what it would mean if going forward, it is again China that is the key partner for vaccine production locally. And what does that mean, geostrategically and for the influence of Europe, United States, and the West more broadly? Before I do that though, Danielle, I want to return to you on this question that we've now heard a lot about from John and from Jens, which is the ecosystem in which you can develop vaccines effectively, what kinds of government support and resources, whether it requires regional cooperation as we saw in Europe. Josana, I'll talk to you about that as well, because you're in the trenches working on it. But Danielle, PAHO has taken on this task and said that as an institution, it will help build this capability to produce mRNA vaccines, as complex as that is, in Latin America, starting in Brazil and Argentina. When you took that on, what kind of innovation ecosystem, legal framework, regional cooperation, resources did you identify as necessary? And have you found that you're succeeding at the pace that is necessary?
Thanks, Benjamin. Yes, so the mRNA platforms is part of the cooperation we're doing and leading in the region. So after the member states saw the dependency of vaccines and other technologies from other markets, they adopted a resolution in September 2021 to increase the production capacity of medicines and other essential health technologies. And with this resolution, so we are recognizing that the region has many advantages. We have Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico as experienced vaccine manufacturer. So we don't want to promote countries without experience to think on building those capacities. So I think that's important. We have potential here: Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico. Many of the countries have strengthened their capacity to conduct clinical trials during the pandemic, so that's good. We have good university training centers with capacity to strengthen the development of qualified human resources that these companies need to scale up. Also, the regional market is relevant for regional producers, so there's attraction there. There's attractive, and the pandemic has motivated the political decision of several governments to promote the manufacture of vaccines and other health technologies in the region, and not only to focus on their national needs. And we have the advantage of the revolving fund that serves as a platform to connect. We can tell manufacturers what are those key vaccines, key strategic vaccines to focus on, or for regional importance, and promote the diversification of sources to complement the global sources with regional sources. So we have a good capabilities here, but we have challenges to build these ecosystems. So we have to develop comprehensive and intersectoral and coherent public policies in many aspects to promote production, to include the public health objectives, to integrate the private sector with the civil society in the dialogue. Also incentives, fiscal incentives for scientific, technological, and industrial development. So there are many aspects that we are focusing to develop, and how we do that. So we have supported the multi-sectoral dialogue and exchange of experience with regional integration mechanisms such as PROSUR, CELAC, and Mercosur. And also we are conducting studies to contribute with the decision making. So studies on production policies and access to vaccines and other technologies. And we are helping, for example, the strengthening regulatory agencies and strengthening even the quality control of laboratories for PPEs. We are implementing one, helping Colombia and Salvador to establish those capacities of quality control for PPEs as on the side of medical devices. So there are many aspects that we are working on, and not only of the mRNA technologies, but we know that we have to foster those ecosystems to be in place.
Yeah, maybe if you could just give me one more minute on the kinds of policy recommendations that have emerged from this platform. I think it's a key priority for ours is to take this approach and say, look, are there lessons learned from government? I mean, I think we'll talk to Josane more about resources that are needed. She works for a public institution, but it sounds like you're talking about legal systems to promote innovation, financial incentives so that scientists know that there are abilities to build private sector companies that can succeed financially. What are the particular policy reforms that maybe you've seen successfully in the region or you've seen resistance to that we could discuss?
Yeah, I'm not the right expert to answer those questions, but what I can tell you is that all these initiatives of the mRNA platforms and other countries that are looking forward to implement their vaccine production capacities. For instance, we have Colombia, we have Chile. So what we have encouraged them is to strengthen the regulatory capacities, but also to look there to make those plans, make those productions being compatible with international standards of quality, such as the WHO pre-qualification. So these sources can participate in the revolving fund and other UN mechanisms that cover other regions of the world. So that's some of the concrete policies in my side that in my scope of work that we have encouraged countries to follow.
Josane, same question for you, which is, what do you think is going well in Brazil? Do you think, again, that you're moving at the right pace and have the ability to really utilize this technology in a way that will help as this virus mutates and as we prepare for other viruses? Are there lessons for other parts of Latin America? And lastly, we've talked now repeatedly about the kind of support that Latin America has received from companies like Moderna, from institutions like PAHO. Is it enough? Should the international community be doing more and supporting countries like Brazil in different ways to enable Brazil to take advantage of its skills and experience in vaccine production and to move faster into this new area?
Okay, thank you, Benjamin. I think I'm going to start with the last questions because I think it's more important. As Jens and Daniel said, it's important to, and John also, it's important to improve the ecosystem. And here in Brazil, even though we have a good production capacity, I think that we have some gaps in some important points to have this ecosystem running better. For instance, some preclinical labs, we need more capacity in this area. Although we have clinical trials runs good, but the preclinical the animal labs need to be improved here in Brazil. Also, it's important to point out that 95% of all goods used in the production of vaccines is imported. We don't have here in Latin America production of, you can see, even equipment, culture media, everything that goes into a production of this very complex drug that's vaccine, it's imported. So policies in this kind of importation fees and this in this market, it's important to us here because you know we pay a lot of taxes in all this importations of all this material. So also another point that is good to point out is the strengthening of the regulatory agencies. Here in Brazil, Anvisa is now classified as a maturity agency, but we know that in Latin America and also in the Caribbean area, we need more regulatory agencies, more strength. So I know that PAHO and also WHO is working in building this kind of capacity because we know that the discussion between the producers and the regulatory agencies, it's very important to speed up the development and also the implementation of the vaccine or the biopharmaceutical in the country. So this is also important to stress. And this is also something that the revolving funds, the community can do for Latin America in order to have this capacity more strong.
John, some of what you just heard, I'm sure, has been something you've explained many times when you've been asked, why isn't Moderna producing more of this vaccine elsewhere? Why can't it be produced in every country? I'd love to hear kind of from your perspective more on those kinds of limitations and barriers, and then we could talk about how to solve them. But you just heard that it isn't just the technology and the procedures, but the inputs themselves, the infrastructure, all of what goes into producing an mRNA vaccine and producing it at scale.
And let me start by the last point that was just made about the importance of regulatory capability. We saw that as a key enabler, both to develop the vaccine, but then also to move at speed. And the regulators that not only have the competence, but have almost like a future-proof capability to adopt or adapt to new technologies are those that will be key partners for innovative companies like mRNA vaccine manufacturers. And so the more that countries can do to invest in their regulatory capability will be to the advantage of creating that ecosystem. What Moderna has done to expand our own production capacity from where we were at the start of the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, we had one production facility in Massachusetts that was only scaled to make small batches of clinical trial material. And so when the pandemic happened in 2020, we very quickly had to scale up. And the only way that we could do that was through partnership. We have more than 10 partnerships around the world that enabled us to make, as I said, 800 million doses in 2021. And as Jens said, the key to that was being able to flawlessly execute the tech transfer. It's an amazingly energy resource intensive exercise involving human beings, to pass on that knowledge. And it was probably the biggest contributor to our success being able to scale up, was having found successful partners around the world. And what you have now seen from Moderna in recent months is like the next version of our global manufacturing strategy to work with individual countries that have prioritized health security and the role that mRNA vaccines can play in that health security, to make sure that they have mRNA capacity on soil. And so we've announced agreements in UK, Canada, and Australia. We are very committed to this idea that mRNA can play a key role in health security. We're only just getting started. There will be more. We've also announced our agreement with the government of Kenya, with the support of the US government and the Africa CDC, to build an mRNA facility there as well. That's a further iteration of our commitment to globalize our production footprint. And we're really only just getting started, right? As I said, it's been 2 years since we've had a commercial vaccine. I think you'll be seeing more from us, and we are very open to further types of collaboration. For us at the moment, it's just a question of bandwidth. 3,500 people is still a lot bigger than 800, but as I said, the resources involved to successfully transfer technology cannot be underestimated.
And so, because you've highlighted that, I feel bad pressing you on why that list isn't longer, but I will anyway. What are sort of the next steps in making sure at least the kind of advice is being spread a bit more widely for what infrastructure is needed, what knowledge needs to be spread, so that countries have what's necessary for mRNA production?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest limitation on doing more of these agreements is finding an agreement to make the investment sustainable. The easy part, the relatively easy part, is building the factory. The more difficult part is to make sure that that factory is sustainable over a long period of time, so that it is there and ready when the future pandemic hits. This is one of the key topics that's being discussed in Africa right now. There was a tech transfer of the J&J vaccine to Aspen in South Africa, and no orders were placed for vaccines from that factory. I know from the discussions I've been a part of with the Africa CDC and industry, this question of building white elephants is very real because of that experience. And what we at Moderna have done to try to address that through our partnerships is to find that win-win solution where we make a commitment to build the factory, and then there's a reciprocal commitment to use the vaccines, to procure the vaccines, from those factories to ensure that they are sustainable. That's not an easy conversation to have. That requires sort of both sides to work in ways they haven't done before. And I think as more governments begin, or more stakeholders begin to prioritize health security, it is certainly our hope that we'll find new ways of working that will enable more of these types of investments.
No, I appreciate that. And given the persistent need for boosters, it would seem like the demand, at least in the short term, is pretty dependable. And hopefully that would be an incentive for investments in the infrastructure to produce throughout the world. Thank you, John. Jens, as promised, I want to return to the broader geostrategic questions that animate so much of our discussion, at least in the foreign policy world, on first medical diplomacy, now vaccine diplomacy. And I also want to acknowledge what you've said, which is absolutely true. The United States was slow on medical diplomacy in terms of sharing personal protective equipment, in terms of sharing test kits, and then again was slow on the donation of vaccines. whereas others, including in Europe, played a much more proactive role. Yet, we're speaking often here about Latin America. I think it still has to be acknowledged that it was Russia and China that were not only the early actors, but still were the primary providers of vaccines in this region. And in fact, as you hinted, the consequences have been serious. The president of Argentina went to visit with Vladimir Putin right before the invasion. And one of the motivations was to thank him for providing Argentina with the Sputnik vaccine and then later to transfer some of that technology. So now as we move into what I call phase 2 of vaccine diplomacy, are these same mistakes being made? As I alluded to earlier, it's the Sputnik, it's now China and the Sinovac company that are in Chile and negotiating elsewhere in Latin America for the local production of the vaccines, even though they are less effective than Moderna's vaccine. But again, it is China that has been, it appears to me, much more proactive about recognizing the desires in places like Latin America to reduce dependency on imported vaccine technology. So Jens, is the West making the same error yet again in this new phase of vaccine diplomacy?
Well, I would say, and again, I need to start with 2 or 3 remarks leading to what you just said, because that from my perspective, that would be too easy to just say it's a mistake or something by the West made again, because what John just mentioned is very important to see. I mean, we had this, I was, as I said, with President Macron in South Africa. Why was the German minister there? Because of BioNTech Pfizer. And we gave financial support actually for the cooperation, for building up production capacities. But, and that's different to Latin America, by the way, we have in some African countries at least, really a high hesitation to get vaccinated. I mean, skepticism even. So actually we cooperate to build up production capacities, and then there are no orders placed and no one wants it. So actually, it is important to really have a good agreement that that actually has all aspects, especially the aspect of profitability, and that there is really a market for it to take into account too. Second, I mean, we are on the way to a real overcapacity. You know, mRNA, even easier, John knows more about it than I do, but easier than the other ways of producing a vaccine, is really something you can scale up quickly once it is there. So actually, from a world perspective, there is more than enough production capacity to serve the world within weeks and months, even with a new variant vaccine. So the question is it wise to build up more and more production capacities on the world whilst there is already more or less, I mean, at least we're on the way to it, an overcapacity. So we have the international division of work, and that is a debate, by the way, we have to have here in Europe as you have it in Latin America or the US or Asia. One thing is the international division of work or labor, and one country does what it can better than the other one, and not every country and region needs to produce everything themselves in a good, in a theory world of world trade. And then we see the issue of sovereignty, of war, of actually here in Europe at least again, and the system, the 2 or 3 systems, China, the Western world, different systems, different ideas, kind of diplomacy connected with it. And so it's, yes, obviously about sovereignty, but then again the question is, for a region like Europe or Latin America, do we need to produce everything on our own in our region? Or do we have friends or partners in the world where we see the relations so sustainable that we trust it? I would never do it with China or obviously with Russia. But the transatlantic partnership, for example, or a partnership with Latin America would be different for me because we are closer together. So actually, all of this, many aspects need to be taken into account if to answer your question about this mistake, because the question is it a one-side mistake then to take the vaccine that has less efficacy, that is actually not the best one or the better one, and that actually, I mean, everything comes as a price, and even the cooperation with China comes with a price. perhaps it needs to be paid somewhere later. I mean, in WHA, in the World Health Assembly, every time China raises its hand, there are some countries, no matter what, voting with China, because if they don't do it, they don't get any vaccines or any investments anymore. So you might go with China on this, but then you are bound to go with China on other issues too. And I would say there are other partners in the world that might be different when it comes to this kind of partnership. So actually, yes, there are some aspects where perhaps we should have, how should I put that, where we could do more to support cooperation with the financial framework, for example, between companies from Europe or the US or other areas, with Latin America, with other regions. But at the same time, I would really say the other aspects, production capacities, division of labor on the world, does really everyone need? I mean, I don't know, you know Latin America better than I do, but is everyone in Mexico happy if the production site is in Chile? I don't know. So it's a question of a regional cooperation then too. But what is important, and that's why I'm so grateful for this discussion and that you actually raised the issue, is that we need to talk and that we need to figure out if there is ground for cooperation and what are the different aspects for cooperation. But I would say it's too easy, the answer, if it is just about is it a mistake or not. There are many aspects to be seen.
Many thanks. We have just about 10 minutes left, and I want to give everyone a final opportunity. And what I would ask is if you could focus on the priorities for governments in regions like Africa and Latin America as they approach this question of health security. Jans has helpfully raised the question of whether that necessarily means that everyone needs complete autonomy when it comes to vaccine production and development. Probably not, and that's not realistic either. But I would like to ask you to think for a minute. Daniel, you'll have less than a minute to think about it because I'm starting with you. What should be the priorities of governments in places like Africa and Latin America going forward when it comes to health security and implementing lessons learned from this pandemic? And we're focusing here, of course, on vaccines.
I think governments has to commit, not only look for their national needs, national aspirations of vaccine manufacture, but the regional approach. So I agree, not necessarily everybody has to produce all the vaccines because it's not sustainable, but commit to make those productions safe and effective following WHO recommendations. And also when they do tech transfers with manufacturers, making sure that those tech transfers do not limit the availability of vaccines to be distributed to countries across the region. So that's very important. So we want those tech transfers to be to impact the whole region and not follow like or segmenting markets as requested from the tech transfer source.
Josane.
Well, I follow the Daniel's thoughts. I think that it's important to Latin America to have this production in our region. Imagine Brazil; it's a country of 220 million people, and it's important to have the local production here because there is no other country in the world that is able to supply to our population all the vaccines needed for the national immunization program. And also during the pandemic, one of the lessons that we learned that we do need the nationalize of the COVID-19 vaccine here in Brazil. If not, we are not able to vaccinate all our population. So it's important to increase the capacity. And also I agree totally with Daniel, the tech transfers need to respect the territory, the Latin America territory, so we can be able to not only to produce to Brazil, but also to able to export to the regions. And then I think that we can supply and we can support the national immunization programs from Latin America. Also in agreement with Argentina, Mexico, and Cuba, that we all are partners together, and then we we can be able to support the national immunization programs of Latin America.
John.
I think the starting point would be for each country to do what we're doing today, which is a very intentional, deep reflection on lessons learned. And I don't think that we can simply assume that all countries are the same or all parts of the world are the same. I think each country has to have their own reflection about their experience during the pandemic, the lessons learned and what it means. And then once that is done, then to think what are the solutions that are fit for purpose for individual countries? You know, as has already been said, you know, a model that may work for Brazil may not work for, you know, a much smaller country. And I would focus initially on the short-term opportunities. You know, hopefully we won't see another pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen with variants. We don't know about other threats to public health that will emerge. And so having the capability to respond quickly, regardless of whether there's manufacturing capacity in a country or not, but having the ability to move quickly, to sign agreements, to have the regulatory capability to support innovative technologies, I think are things that every country can do in the short term that would lead to immediate benefits. And then there's the longer term reflection on I think building a sustainable ecosystem for innovation in vaccines, in mRNA, or in new and emerging technology is key. And part of that is to make it sustainable, is to reap the benefits of those vaccines by really creating a robust adult vaccination program. So that there is, as Jens said, the market for these innovative technologies. Again, I don't think you need a factory to do that, but indeed a factory could be part of that equation. And then finally, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, with regard to some of the more recent agreements that we've done, is thinking outside the box, not applying the normal procurement rules to vaccines, which usually has a 12-month window. But if you think longer term about how to create a sustainable ecosystem, then adapting your purchasing models to fit your long-term goals.
Jens, I know I asked everyone to think about what governments in regions like Latin America should be doing now. I'm actually going to tweak it slightly for you, if you'll permit, and think about what should the German government, the French government, the US government, the UK be doing to support this process. Now, again, you've pointed out that maybe that doesn't mean making sure every country everywhere produces every vaccine, but we have talked about lots of changes in innovation ecosystems and laws, in technology transfer and policy. What is the role of governments like the German government in supporting the implementation of these lessons learned and making sure there's better preparation for the next pandemic?
Well, first question is, what is the lesson learned? And I would say the lesson learned for us at least, and I would say for many countries, hopefully at least, is that the short-term national interest might not be the long-term national interest. What do I mean? On short term, it might be the national interest to keep your vaccine for yourself if you are lucky enough to be a country where it was developed, where our researchers and companies. But on the long term, that's not really the national interest, because it's in the national interest to have partners in the world. It's a very dependent world. We will need each other sooner or later, mutually. So actually, if you really talk about national interest in a pandemic situation, a crisis situation, you should always think about your partners or possible partners, which brings us to diplomacy or others in the world acting too. And that is a lesson learned definitely for us here in Europe. I can only do the European Union perspective. That it is in our, I mean, why did we do 27 instead of Germany buys it for itself? Because we said it's in our national interest that Croatia, Bulgaria, Portugal, countries that might not have a vaccine from the first day of approval, that they are partners with us in this crisis, and they see we help each other because it helps afterwards. And that counts on a world stage too. So actually, as I said, the most important lesson learned for me is that we think about our partners we have already or possible partners in the world in a crisis, and not act like only for us or our region, but try to cooperate from the very beginning with those who want to cooperate and those who want to be partners. And that, by the way, counts for a region too. As I know the African Union better than the Latin or Pan American organizations, but I know that even within an African Union, and that counts for a European Union too, sometimes even especially in the crisis, you might call yourself a union, but even within the union, there are many national interests. That needs to be seen and thought about it too. Sovereignty and autarky, by the way, are two different things. So again, it's all about partnership and thinking about partnership from the very beginning. That's my lesson learned from this crisis.
Thank you, Jens, Daniel, Hosanne. John, this was, for me, spectacularly useful conversation. As we've talked about earlier, we at the Wilson Center are deeply interested in the lessons learned from the pandemic, particularly in regions like Latin America and Africa, how places like the United States and the EU and others and PAHO can be supportive, the role of the private sector in this, and how preparedness for, unfortunately, the likelihood of future pandemics needs to be an issue that we address now and not in the moment where it occurs, even though, again, Moderna has shown extraordinary ability to move very quickly. And Jens, you've pointed out the historic approach that was taken in vaccine production distribution. But I think everyone acknowledges we could do it even better next time through greater international regional cooperation and through implementing a lot of the ideas we just discussed right now. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who joined us for this conversation. Thank you for sharing some of your insights and questions to inform our dialogue. And please join us in the future as we talk about this and other issues related to Latin America and the world.